Educators in 4 Massachusetts school districts went on strike this year. They asked for wage increases, class size adjustments, and better workplace conditions, among other things. Of course, going on strike is against state law for public employees of this nature, and walking out of the building meant walking into hot water with the government. Less than 1/5 of the country allows teachers to strike in the context of collective bargaining, but new bills on Beacon Hill seek to add the Bay State to that list. It'll be a heavy lift. Previous legislative efforts died a quiet death without coming up for a vote, and even the new Democratic governor, Maura Healey, has indicated such a bill would leave her desk with a veto rather than a signature. I'm Jennifer Smith with Commonwealth Magazine, and this week we're getting into public employee strikes. I'm joined by Senator Becca Rausch and Tom Scott, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
Senator, you've put forward a bill that would allow some public employees to go on strike. We'll get into the details of that bill in a moment, but for now, why did this seem like the right time to file the legislation?
This bill's actually been previously filed. I first filed it last session. And I think there have been various different iterations over several sessions. Last session, it was a pretty quiet bill. And then at the beginning of this session, all of a sudden, it was a very loud bill. And so there's been clearly a real shift in the attention on public employees and particularly unionized public employees. And I think that's part of why this conversation has increased so much in magnitude over the last several months.
And Tom, what has the past year looked like for you in terms of teacher strikes in Massachusetts? The recent ones in Haverhill and Woburn come to mind.
Well, I guess the way I would look at it is we've certainly seen an uptick in the number of strikes this year, significantly greater than we've probably seen in my 20 years being in this position. So clearly there's something afoot in terms of the concerns that are out there and the need for some of these districts to go on strike based on the conflict that they have with the negotiation process. So, I would say that there's certainly a significant difference in what we're seeing. And we're certainly seeing a big difference in the relationship between the union and management. With school committees, superintendents, we've seen a significant uptick there in terms of the way that relationship seems to be struggling in a number of these districts, particularly where there's collective bargaining taking place.
What dynamics have been interesting to you, Senator, as you've been kind of watching this sort of uptick in strikes over the past few years, either in terms of the relationships that Tom mentions or in terms of what the demands might be?
I think there are a couple of things that are striking to me, or at least noteworthy for me, that kind of stick out in my mind just as not only as a senator and the lead filer on this bill, but also as a parent of kids in public schools, and the only mom of kids under 10 in the entirety of the Senate. I think that teachers want to teach, and every time I hear from teachers, they're pretty consistent across the board. They didn't get into this for other reasons. They got into this line of work because they want to teach. They want to be in the classrooms with kids, engaging with students and helping them learn and grow and thrive, not just in a very sort of traditional academic way, but in a social emotional way, and in so many ways that, frankly, I as a parent deeply, deeply appreciate. And so what I think is a really kind of standout aspect of this is that when teachers are voting to strike or in fact striking, they're doing so for reasons that, not because they don't want to be in the classroom. They want to be in the classroom. They want to be teaching, and they are striking because the issues that have come to a head are critical for the students, families, and communities that they serve. And related, the parents and the communities are consistently across the board rallying behind their teachers. And in fact, we just saw data come out earlier this week, in fact, showing widespread support for this policy change across the Bay State, where more than 2 out of 3, right? Better than 2 to 1, more than 2 to 1 ratio support this bill. And I think those are really important things. And that's not to say that we parents don't understand what it means to not be able to have your kids in school. We do get that, right? I get that too. I am a parent of elementary age kids. We had to figure out what to do, particularly in those early days of COVID when nobody knew what we were doing, and we were all building the plane as we were flying it, so to speak. And that's hard. And even knowing how hard that is, the parents and communities are still, by significant majorities, rallying around their teachers in support of their teachers.
So I'm glad that you brought up the polling, Senator. So the polling that you're referring to is from Northwind Strategies, and it found 67% of respondents at least somewhat supported strikes when asked, and we're big sticklers for the importance of question phrasing here. Do you support or oppose allowing public school teachers to go on strike to fight for higher wages and improved working conditions? So, Tom, how did that kind of poll result end up striking, for lack of a better word, you?
Sure. Listen, having children go through schools, having grandchildren go through schools, I support the teachers 100%. They're there, and I think the senator is absolutely correct. They took this job because they enjoy being with children, and they enjoy teaching what they teach, and so that's what we want to have happen. No question about it. I also know that being a superintendent and a principal for many years, there's a big distinction between being a classroom teacher and being part of a union. And most teachers don't like a strike. They just don't want to be out of the classroom. They want to be with children. And in many ways, it's really, when I would ask a teacher a question, they'd sort of say to me, well, do I speak to this with my teacher hat on or my union hat on? And sometimes a lot of what gets directed in terms of the heat around negotiations is that teachers feel uncomfortable in many ways through this process. And unions pretty much direct. The leadership pretty much directs. Teachers generally are not going to fight where the union wants to go with respect to the collective bargaining agreement. A lot of work that's going on with a minimum number of people gets presented to the membership or to the general public without really the insight of what's really deep in the weeds in terms of what goes on in those negotiations. So it all comes out to sort of a more heated moment in terms of how these decisions get made. I think they leave everybody feeling very uncomfortable. Does nothing to promote the culture of the school or the district, which I believe, and certainly from my conversations with superintendents, can have long-term damaging effects.
So in Massachusetts, public employees are allowed to collectively bargain, but not allowed to strike. Traditionally, as both of you have referenced, the strike is one of a union's most, I'd say, how do we put this neutrally, effective bargaining tools, generally speaking. So what's the rationale for limiting the right to strike, Senator? Because your bill would limit it for the first 6 months.
Look, I think, I just want to kind of circle back to something Tom just said, it would be impossible just logistically for every teacher to be in the room as contract negotiations are going on. That's just, I'm not sure we have rooms that big, right? We have a lot of teachers, and it's really hard to have a conversation with hundreds of people. And so you have to necessarily, have some representatives, helping those negotiations along. But at the end of the day, a vote to strike is a vote among the entire membership of any union. And to be clear, this bill is not just about public school teachers, right? This is about lots of public employees who are unionized. I myself was a unionized public employee in the executive branch before I was elected to the Senate. And, and the right to strike is one of the most foundational rights for workers that we have. The reason that there's a 6-month period built into the bill is because I think everybody agrees that a strike should be a measure of last resort. Again, teachers want to teach, right? Employees want to be on the job. This is people got into public service because they wanted to do public service, whether that's in a classroom or otherwise. So the 6-month provision in the bill, and just for the listeners, that means the bill says you have to have good faith negotiations for a period of at least 6 months before a strike can even be considered. And we wanted to really stress in the bill and show on its face that a strike is a measure of last resort. When things have really broken down, there's just no other way to, move forward at that stage of the game.
Tom, do you think that the tools that teachers and paraprofessionals have to negotiate are sufficient? Why not allow strikes as one of them?
Well, Massachusetts has a pretty liberal law around collective bargaining. I mean, you compare that to anything national. Teachers have the ability to protest in a lot of different ways, and they do so. They can go to school committee meetings. They can go to just town meetings. They can go to the front steps of their elected officials. They have lots of ways that they can make their message known to the general public. Uh, I think the issue is not whether they have the tools. I think that do they use all the tools, right? So too often, for example, in examples this year, a number of cases where they choose not to go to mediation. Now, why wouldn't you use the mediation as a tool, bringing in an independent party to try to bring the parties together in terms of really looking at it, or binding arbitration? I mean, there are tools that we have that are not being used. And my fear, and the fear I think for a lot of people, is that if you create the law that says they can go immediately to strike after 6 months without using the tools that exist there, I mean, what you're doing is just disrupting a lot of lives. Most importantly, to the lives of children. So, I don't think the tools are all being used the way they were designed to be used, and I think there are other ways to deal with the issue.
So there must be some lessons that we've learned during the pandemic about this and about the way that we're kind of conceptualizing what a workplace would look like, the ways that you have available to kind of advocate for changes inside the workplace, but also the balance between kind of making sure that there are teachers' concerns being met and then also kind of impact on families. So, Senator, do you want to either respond to what Tom just said or kind of dive into the pandemic aspects of the bill?
Sure. I think, look, I think we all probably agree that teachers do a lot. And they do a lot in the classroom, they do a lot outside of the classroom. And so I wonder how reasonable it is to expect our teachers to not only teach in the classroom and use their own personal funds often to supplement the materials that they don't have in the classroom. One of the things that teachers have gone on strike over, to then also have to show up at school committee meetings and also have to show up in multiple different places in order to get their point across, and to show those. And I've actually had many conversations with superintendents in my district and beyond, who know readily and totally agree that we are strapped for resources, that we have cost increases in certain ways that are really significantly impacting school budgets for the upcoming fiscal years, that are going to have potentially pretty significant negative repercussions. Which tools are reasonable to expect people to have to use in order to get the results that they need and deserve? And the they I'm using there is quite broad, right? Not just the teachers and not just the paraprofessionals and the other staff in the schools, but also the children and the families and the communities at large. And striking and having that tool in your negotiating toolbox, I think, is a really important factor to be able to even out the negotiating strength of both parties when they come to the table.
Gotcha. And then let's take a pivot into the pandemic question, which is, Tom, kind of to you, what lessons have you taken away from the past 2.5, 3 years at this point about kind of the role of schools as not just educational institutions, but also as child care facilities, and what kind of obligation that does or doesn't end up imposing?
Yeah, and it's an important question, right? We've gone through a really tough time, and you cannot ask the teachers to do more than what they did during this period of time. I mean, there's just no question about that. And I think that, in part, I think that sort of plays into a little bit about just the climate that we're in right now, which I think is really difficult for at best. And it's not just for teachers; it's for everybody who's employed in the schools, principals, superintendents. They're exhausted, and it's not over yet, right? I mean, we would like to think that we're back to normal. We are not back to normal. All right. We still have a lot of dysregulated kids and adults. And sometimes I think the adults are a little bit more dysregulated than the kids are. So that's a big issue, right? And the schools have to deal with that. We also have a political climate, which is, we've never seen before in terms of the divisions it's created. And there's the levels of sort of, nasty hatred kind of spewing of ideals that I think we just haven't seen. So I think there's a sort of perfect storm in some ways that has kind of added to the dimension of this. I look back to the past 8 years. We've had Janus decision. That puts unions in a whole different place in terms of having to prove their worth to their members, right? That plays, I'm sure, to the way in which unions think about, it's not just local, it's national, in terms of how they play to their membership. We have the issues that go on in terms of the dysregulation they talked about. We have the economy. We have high inflation factor. So that's going to play into that as well. We have a lot of social justice issues, what I think is just playing into not just the teacher, but I think for at least for the MTA is playing into rightfully the issue about how do we provide compensation for our paraprofessionals and aides who do a really important job in our schools. So all of that is different. And our membership, if you look at it, where are these strikes? They're all happening with the MTA. They're not. I haven't seen an AFT Massachusetts strike yet. Not to say that there won't be one, but they're all coming out of MTA. So it's a leadership issue here too, in terms of the encouragement that's taking place within some of these districts in terms of how they proceed with these issues of conflict. So that's the climate. That's what we're dealing with, and it is not making it easier. And perfectly, one of the issues for me, and I deal with this on a daily basis, is I see superintendents under enormous stress. We're having really difficult time finding people to be school superintendents. We're having hard time maintaining with our principals. We have seen a lot of changing over our principalship, and we just don't have a pipeline for them right now. And part of that is, listen, it's hard for teachers for sure, and we're having pipeline issues there as well. But leading in these environments, because that's really where a lot of the issues go, is becoming really problematic.
I'd love to just chime in. So let's again point out some of the places where we completely agree. We are not free of COVID. It's not actually over. We still have, I think we're going to continue to feel long-term ramifications from the peak of COVID for a very long time. And we're seeing cases continue to come up in various different ways. And I also completely agree with Tom that the stress factor related to COVID is very real, both for adults and for children. One of my personal priorities as a legislator has been youth mental health, and increasingly so. I've heard from students in my district directly who said we need better and different mental health care, and that's why I worked so hard with Samaritans to set up a youth only mental health text called Hey Sam that anybody can text, by the way. Just text Hey Sam and there'll be a youth on the other end of the text thread to respond. But I think the place where we start to differ is about the utility and benefits of unionization to help address some of those concerns, right? High unionization levels are associated with positive economic, personal, and democratic outcomes. Unions have also been shown to help reduce gender and racial and ethnic wage gaps. And I think we probably could all agree that a huge disproportionate impact of COVID fell on women and people of color in a variety of different ways, including probably among your paraprofessionals, plural, throughout various school districts all across the Commonwealth. And I also think we can't deny or look away from the fact that teaching as a profession is still quite gendered. And Jen, you led us into this conversation with a question about schools effectively also being in some ways a method of childcare, which is highly gendered in terms of a profession and a work space and a sector. And, that is historically, and I think even still today to a certain degree, considered women's work. And so we see disparity in those wages and in the respect given to teachers and paraprofessionals. I want to be clear, that's not coming from the superintendents. That's a systemic thing that we have to grapple with as a society, and continue to work on. But it also shows why this bill is so important, why the work we're doing on youth mental health is so important, and actually that mental health support and providing more school counselors is one of the things that teachers have gone on strike over.
And so thinking about the mental health aspect, I think that takes us pretty neatly into the question of impacts here, not just of going on strike, but also, again, kind of the pandemic really, I think, shone a bright light on what happens when education structures and routines are disrupted. So what's the thinking, Tom, around how to factor in learning loss and also kind of disruptions to family scheduling that can be created by strikes, and ways that that might either be mitigated, or if you think it can't be mitigated?
Sure. Well, first, let me just say the senator has been a leader around the mental health issue, and that is one of the biggest issues that we face today. No question about it. We have seen remarkably different responses from youngsters, particularly young children, who don't know how to manage some of that. So that we have great needs there. So I want to just reinforce that. The other thing I would just say is the issue around unions and collective bargaining. Listen, I benefited from unions. My wife benefited from unions. My daughter currently benefits from teacher union. So this is not about the value of a teacher union. It has a high value, and we all recognize that. I mean, all of us as superintendents, we were there. I was on negotiation teams. I know where that comes from. The point really is more about what's the marginal difference by having a strike, and I think that the superintendents I talk to who have gone through strikes, in most cases, not to say all, in most cases, there's a marginal difference. There really isn't much of a difference when you go through it. The difference really happens to be the impact that it has on the culture of that school. Schools are pretty much collaborative institutions. The only way we make progress is by the way that we work together. When you have a strike, you have things happen in terms of the dynamics of those relationships, which is a huge schism, which doesn't just resolve itself after when the strike is over. It continues over time, and there's a damaging effect to that. So when we talk about, it's not the mental health part of this, but it certainly has to do with the overall climate. I would say, in terms of getting to your point, Jen, about the sort of mental health issue, what I would say is that one of the reasons that I think a lot of us feel strongly that it's really the wrong time to have a strike is we have gone through such a difficult time. For children to be missing school for any extended period of time is not a good idea. It certainly presents its own childcare issues. We understand that, but more importantly, schools, we've found out through the pandemic, is a critically important social emotional experience. And you cannot make up the days. When you miss a week of school, you'd like to think that, oh no, we'll make that up at the end of the year. There's no difference. There's no comparison between missing a week in January and trying to make it up at the end of June. So is there a learning loss time? I believe there is. Is there a loss in terms of sort of the continuation of the relationships that are so important for children through the regular routines that they demand by their own nature? I think it is disrupted. And I think those are important elements to this sort of, social, emotional, mental health component.
Before we go, I want to make sure to let the senator kind of respond to the disruption question.
Of course. Thank you so much. There's a fact here that strikes and votes to strike yield better results faster for teachers and students and communities at large. And that's been kind of proven every single time along the road here. And we also can't ignore, while I appreciate the tension that Tom is talking about, we also can't ignore the tension that comes from disgruntled staff, right? Staff who aren't making enough money, staff who don't have enough ventilation in their classrooms, staff who don't have support, And we have an educator shortage, right, which started before COVID-19, and certainly was exacerbated by the pandemic. And so when we have higher pay and better conditions and better supports, we also have better quality of teachers and more retention, and more consistency. So, and we also know that kids across the board have, higher needs now. And so we need those mental health supports in classrooms, and we need those supplies, and we need right? Kids can't learn if they're hungry. Right? Kids can't learn if they are struggling with a mental health need. They can't. And, and that's what the teachers are fighting for. And that's what they are trying to get at, right? Nurses, counselors, healthy meals, ventilation, all of these things are really critical to the learning environment, and good pay and good benefits, which many of our teachers have. And we are getting closer for our paraprofessionals. But we're still not there, right? Paraprofessionals typically start at a salary of only $22,000 a year. That's just really tough to live on. And we can't ignore all of the complexity that comes into this particular situation, and the needs that, in fact, the folks who have gone out on strike are seeking to address, and in fact are addressing them through these collective actions.
And did you want to add anything on kind of how you balance those, legitimate concerns with the sort of practical disruption that can be kind of caused just during the period of, I'm thinking, of course, Woburn, it didn't go into 2 weeks, it did, 1 week strike. So kind of what the impacts of that sort of delay end up looking like, as Tom raised, kind of you have to make that up somewhere.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I would characterize it as a delay. I think back to when I was a kid, there was a giant snowstorm and we missed a whole week of school in October. And there was so much snow, we could actually jump out the second story window and land in the snow. It was just massive. It was really early. And we missed a week and we made it up at the end. And, as I said earlier in our conversation today, I get it. I get how hard it is when, kids can't be in school. I am a parent of public school students, a proud public school student parent, and a product of public schools myself. My father was a teacher. I get that. I get that in so many ways, both as a senator and as a mom. And I think we've provided for a balance in the bill by putting in that 6-month period that says you have to negotiate in 6 months, for a period of 6 months in good faith to try to get to that resolution before anybody even thinks about a strike, right? Strikes are a last resort.
Okay, I think we could all probably talk about this for another 3 hours, but we do not have the time. So thank you so much to Senator Becca Rausch and to Tom Scott, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Association of School Superintendents. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next week.